February 4, 2022. Beijing. Winter sunlight hits the marble outside the Great Hall of the People like a blade. Inside, the cameras are hungry, the handshakes are practiced, and the smiles are calibrated to the millimeter. But behind the official photos, past the flags, past the translators, past the lacquered doors, there's a quieter moment that barely makes a sound. A single sentence, spoken softly, that will outlive the applause. No limits. No forbidden areas. And in that moment, the future of a war that hasn't even started yet, quietly inherits its first lifeline. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you isn't the war you've been watching. It's the war underneath the war. The one fought with invoices, pressure, pride, and one country that could tilt the whole outcome, but won't. Now listen closely. There's a story the world keeps telling itself. That wars end when armies break. That peace arrives when leaders come to their senses. That if we just wait long enough, the violence burns itself out like a fire with no oxygen. But what if the oxygen is still being delivered? What if the war isn't continuing because it's unstoppable, but because it's being quietly, steadily, conveniently fed? And what if the one country with the leverage to choke that supply has decided it's not in their interest to do it? Comment right now where you're watching from, and what time it is there. I want to see how far this message travels. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the hidden architecture of modern war, and the most uncomfortable truth in geopolitics. Sometimes the fastest way to end a war is not to send more weapons. It's to close the warehouse doors, to turn off the pipeline valve, to make the parts stop arriving. And there is exactly one country positioned to do that at scale without firing a shot. China. Not because China is the villain of this story. Not because China started the war. But because China sits on the choke points that keep a sanctioned state breathing. And because China, more than any other major power, can whisper into Moscow's ear without shouting across an ocean. So today, we're going to walk through the real mechanics. Slowly. Dramatically. Like a forensic team stepping through footprints. And at the end, you'll understand why the title isn't a question. The one country that could stop this war, and won't. February 24, 2022. Before dawn. The first missiles arc. The first columns roll. The world watches the border turn into a headline. And immediately, everyone asks the same question. How long? How long can Russia sustain it? How long can Ukraine survive it? How long before the world gets tired, distracted, divided? But the more important question, almost nobody asks, is this. What does Russia need to keep fighting? Not in speeches. Not in slogans. In parts. In fuel. In money. In replacement components that never appear on patriotic posters. Because modern war is not just bravery and brutality. It's manufacturing. It's logistics. It's supply chains that either hold or snap. Now imagine a factory in Russia, mid-2022. Not a glamorous one. Not a cinematic one. A gray industrial building with peeling paint and fluorescent lights that flicker like a tired heartbeat. Inside, an engineer, let's call her Anya, a composite character, stands over a machine that's supposed to cut metal with surgical precision. A CNC machine. Computer-controlled. The kind of machine that takes raw material and turns it into something that fits perfectly inside something else. And that something else is what makes war possible. Anya isn't thinking about ideology. She's thinking about tolerances. Microns. Because if the machine is off by a fraction, a component fails. If a component fails, the system fails. And if the system fails, a soldier doesn't come home. But here's the twist. One day, the machine stops. Not because it's destroyed. Not because it's old. Because a tiny electronic component, a module the size of a deck of cards, burns out. And that component isn't made in Russia. It isn't easily substituted. It isn't available in the usual markets anymore. So Anya's boss doesn't call a general. He calls a procurement contact. And that contact doesn't call the Kremlin. He calls a middleman. And the middleman calls a supplier. And the supplier is not in Europe. Not in America. Not in Japan. The supplier is in a network that runs east. And that is how wars continue in the 2020s. Not with one dramatic decision, but with 1,000 quiet approvals. Comment this. Do you think wars end on battlefields or in boardrooms? Type battlefield or boardroom. Now let's zoom out. Because if you look at the war like a machine, you start seeing patterns. Sanctions squeeze. Routes adapt. Payments reroute. Companies appear, disappear, rebrand, relocate. The public sees a wall. The system sees a maze. And in that maze, China is not just a country. It's a corridor. A manufacturing superpower that produces enormous quantities of dual-use goods, electronics, machinery, industrial tools, things that can be civilian in paperwork and military in application. And when a country under pressure needs to keep production lines alive, it doesn't always need finished weapons. Sometimes it just needs the ability to make them, the ability to repair, the ability to scale, the ability to keep the machine humming. Now, that alone doesn't mean China is controlling Russia. That's the lazy version of this story. The real version is more chilling. China doesn't need to control Russia to have leverage over Russia. China simply needs to be the supplier that is hardest to replace. Because leverage is not magic. Leverage is scarcity. Leverage is dependency. Leverage is being the hand on the oxygen tank while insisting you're not in the room. And here's the next reveal, because every viral story has to take you to the edge and then push. China also holds leverage through energy. Because when a sanctioned economy loses markets, it turns to the markets that remain. And energy isn't just money. Energy is the bloodstream. It funds budgets. It stabilizes currency. It keeps wages paid. It buys time. And time is what wars consume. Now imagine another room. Not in Moscow. Not in Kiev. In Beijing. Late 2022. A policy advisor, call him Mr. Lin, another composite, stands by a window looking down at traffic moving like ants. On his desk, reports, forecasts, graphs. But the most important thing on his desk isn't a chart. It's a question. What outcome serves China? Not what outcome is fair. Not what outcome is moral. What outcome is useful? And if that sounds cold, it's because states don't run on feelings. They run on interests. Now let's be clear. China has repeatedly framed itself as supporting peace, negotiations, ceasefires, and stability. And yet, the war continues. So the question becomes, if China wants peace, why not use the leverage? Why not squeeze the corridor? Why not tighten the oxygen flow? Because the answer is not one thing. It's a stack, a layered cake of reasons. Reason 1, strategic balance. In geopolitics, a weakened Russia can become a dependency, but a collapsed Russia can become chaos. And chaos is unpredictable. Reason 2, precedent. If China joins Western-style economic warfare today, what happens tomorrow when China is the target of similar pressure? Reason 3, domestic priorities. Stability, growth, avoiding shocks. Avoiding the kind of disruption that makes citizens nervous and investors flee. Reason 4, the long game. If global attention and resources are tied up in Europe, other regions shift. Other opportunities open. Other pressures ease. This is not good or evil. This is the logic that rules great powers. And it's why the one country that could meaningfully shift the sustainability of the war hesitates to do so. Comment this. If you were China's leader, what would you prioritize? Global stability or strategic advantage? Type stability or advantage. Now, February 24, 2023. 1 year into the war. A date that matters because it's symbolic. Anniversary dates are when governments try to seize narrative control. And on that date, China publishes a position paper: respect sovereignty, abandon Cold War mentality, cease hostilities, resume talks, protect civilians, reduce nuclear risks, oppose unilateral sanctions, keep supply chains stable, promote reconstruction. On paper, it sounds like a blueprint for peace. But here's the problem with paper. Paper is easy. Reality is not. Reality requires enforcement. Reality requires pressure. Reality requires making someone lose something they don't want to lose. So the paper lands like a feather on a battlefield made of steel. And critics say it's vague. It doesn't bind anyone. It doesn't force. It doesn't commit. It's a statement meant to position China as responsible, while keeping its options open. That ambiguity is the key. Because ambiguity is how you avoid being forced to choose. And choosing is expensive. Now, let's bring you to the front line, but not with bullets. With a voice. Spring 2023. A Ukrainian logistics officer, call her Oksana, composite, sits in a bunker with a laptop covered in dust. She's tracking incoming aid, outgoing repairs, lost vehicles, fuel use. And she hears a rumor from intelligence channels that doesn't sound like a rumor. It sounds like a pattern. Russia's war production isn't collapsing the way people predicted. Not because Russia is invincible, but because the war machine has found ways to patch itself, to substitute, to reroute, to keep the skeleton moving. And the whisper she can't stop hearing is, China. Not soldiers. Not flags. Goods. Machinery. Electronics. The boring things that decide whether a factory can run. Now here's the next emotional beat. Because this isn't just geopolitics. It's human. If you're Ukrainian, this isn't a chessboard. It's your life. It's your city. It's your family. If you're Russian, it's your brothers sent into mud and mines. If you're European, it's your security and your economy. If you're American, it's your alliances and your credibility. And if you're Chinese, it's your long-term rise and your vulnerability to containment. Everybody has a story they tell themselves. And those stories collide over the bodies of people who never got a vote. Comment: do you think peace is more likely to come from negotiation or from exhaustion? Type negotiation or exhaustion. Now, I'm going to show you the engine room. And it starts with a word that should terrify you because it sounds harmless. Dual use. Dual use is the perfect camouflage for modern conflict. It means an item has civilian uses and military uses. It means a component can be used in a refrigerator factory or a drone production line. It means a machine tool can make car parts or weapons parts. It means an electronic board can control agricultural equipment or guidance systems. So when pressure rises, the question becomes: how do you stop the flow of dual-use items without breaking the global economy? How do you police every shipment, every intermediary, every transshipment hub, every company that changes names like a snake shedding skin? And that's why wars today don't just happen on maps. They happen in customs data, in shipping manifests, in payment systems, in bank compliance meetings where someone says, technically, it's legal, and everyone pretends not to notice what it means in practice. Now, April 2025. Another date that matters. Because by that point, the war has matured into a grinding system, and reports swirl about trade, energy, LNG, rerouted oil shipments, and payment arrangements that reduce exposure to Western monitoring. Again, this isn't a single conspiracy. It's adaptation. It's survival. It's the war machine learning how to live under constraints. And China, intentionally or not, sits at the center of that adaptation. Now, let's ask the forbidden question. The one people whisper but rarely say out loud. If China truly slammed the door, tightened trade, tightened components, tightened the corridor, would Russia be forced to change course? Would the war end? Or would Russia escalate, lash out, or find another path? Here's the truth. Nobody can guarantee the exact ending. But leverage changes probabilities. Leverage changes timelines. Leverage changes costs. And that alone is power. So why won't China use it? Because power isn't only about what you can do. It's about what you're willing to pay to do it. And the cost for China isn't just economic. It's strategic. It risks pushing Russia into desperation. It risks collapsing a partner. It risks strengthening Western unity against China. It risks setting a precedent that global economic warfare is the normal tool, used by whoever has the bigger economy. China looks at that and sees a future where the weapon can be turned around. So China chooses the move that preserves optionality. Talk peace. Avoid binding commitments. Continue trade where possible. Oppose certain sanctions. Maintain the partnership without owning the war. It's the ultimate geopolitical balancing act. And it is why the war keeps breathing. Comment: if China cut critical support tomorrow, do you think the war would end within a year? Type yes or no, and tell me why. Now, let's go back to the very first scene. Beijing, February 4th, 2022. The handshakes. The sentence, no limits. Because that sentence wasn't just diplomacy. It was insurance. It told Moscow, you won't be alone. It told the world, there is an alternative axis. And it told everyone watching closely that this war, if it came, would not be fought in isolation. Now fast forward. 2022 becomes 2023. 2023 becomes 2024. And the world's attention becomes a resource. Sometimes abundant. Sometimes scarce. Because attention is what democracies spend. And when attention moves, pressure changes. That's another reason China won't do it. Why burn political capital to end a war when time might hand you advantages? Why force an outcome when you can let the West argue with itself? Let sanctions leak. Let unity strain. Let fatigue grow. In that scenario, doing nothing isn't passive. Doing nothing is a strategy. But doing nothing has a price. And the price is paid in people. Now, I want you to picture a final scene. Not a battlefield. A conference room. Neutral carpets. Bottled water. Flags arranged like theater props. Somewhere in the future, negotiators sit down again. And the cameras will record the handshake. And the headlines will say, talks begin. But the real negotiation won't be in the handshake. It will be in the numbers. In the unseen promises. In the quiet guarantees. In the trade flows that either tighten or loosen. And if you listen closely, behind every demand and every concession, you'll hear the ghost of the same question. What will China tolerate? Because that is the shadow behind this war. The unspoken factor. The one country that could tighten the corridor and force the war machine to feel real scarcity. And won't. Not because it can't. Because it has calculated that it shouldn't. And that is the most disturbing kind of truth. A war can be technically stoppable. And still be allowed to continue. Because stopping it doesn't benefit the people with leverage. Now, before we end, I want to challenge you with one final thought. If you're angry, good. Anger means you understand the stakes. But aim the anger at the correct target. Not a single nation. Not a single leader. The system. A world where supply chains can be weaponized. Where sanctions create shadow routes. Where peace statements can coexist with war-sustaining trade. Where neutrality can look like balance and function like oxygen. So here's the real cliffhanger, the one we're all living inside. What would have to happen for China to decide the war is no longer in its interests? A global market shock? A direct threat to China's economy? A rupture in the partnership? Secondary sanctions that actually bite? A fear that prolonged war creates instability that spills into places China can't control? Or something darker, something that forces Beijing to choose a side in a way it has avoided for decades? Comment your answer. What is the single event that would make China change course? Because until that event happens, the corridor stays open, the machine keeps running, and the war keeps breathing. And somewhere in some factory, Anya's machine whirs back to life, not because the war is just, but because the part arrived. And it arrived because someone, somewhere, decided. Not yet. Not now. Not worth the cost. The one country that could stop this war. And won't.